and welcome to the Straz Center's Arts and Mind Village Chat. I'm Fred Johnson. I'm really happy to be with you today and with all of these amazing friends as we have a conversation about music as a healing modality. You know that our Arts and Mind Village Chat is all about the arts and the importance of the arts and the health and well-being, both on a personal level and on a communal level. And we are really, really honored to collaborate on this project with Susan Magsamen and the Arts and Mind Lab at Johns Hopkins University. Susan, welcome, welcome, welcome. So happy that you are here. We'll get started. I want to introduce everybody and then we'll get right at it. First and foremost, my friends, we have a combined conversation about kind of research and science along with the practical application of art. So we have both artists as well as folk who are in the arts and science community. First, I'll introduce the Executive Director of the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, Ms. Tracy Hyder-Suffren. Tracy joined the National Jazz Museum in Harlem as Executive Director in 2017. She has more than 20 years in the field of racial justice, poverty, gender, and other issues of equity and social justice, as well as the arts. She has prioritized Jazz Is at the museum, which is programming that explores intersections between jazz and social justice, wellness and neuroscience, and unexpected cultural and political areas. Provides the museum as a free open rehearsal space for jazz and jazz-related artists, and has overseen unprecedented growth in education programming, community engagement, and museum attendance. She is an alumni of Tufts University, and also she holds a certificate in teaching English to speakers of other languages from Cambridge University, and is a tribal member of the Ramapo Lenape Nation and co-chief of the Lenape Nation Martin Band in Staten Island. Welcome, Tracy. Next, we have Dr. Tasha Golden. Let me turn this sideways so I can read it. I'm sorry. Tasha is a PhD as a senior artist in health research science at the International Arts and Mind Lab and Brain Science Institute at Johns Hopkins Medicine. As a public health researcher and innovator, she studies the impact of arts, culture, and aesthetics on well-being, health research, and community health. Dr. Gordon has recently presented and consulted for the National Creating Health Communities Initiative, which is a part of the University of Florida's Art Place America, Grants Makers in Health, and the Trust for Public Land. And she was a speaker at Politico's 2019 Annual Healthcare Summit in Amsterdam. Tasha's visionary work is bolstered by a career as an artist and entrepreneur. As a singer-songwriter for the critically acclaimed band Ellery, she toured full-time in the US and abroad, and her songs have been in feature films and TV dramas. Holding a PhD in public health, draws on her interdisciplinary background to develop innovative partnerships and practices that optimize health access, inclusivity, and communications. Welcome, Dr. Tasha Golden. Dr. Lauren Murray. She is a native Floridian and enjoys an active career as a recitalist, chamber musician, and educator with trumpeter Robert Murray, same name. Her hubby, she is co-founder of the duo Harmonie del Sur, hailed for their wonderful musical rapport, impeccable intonation, and exquisite performances. Their collaboration has brought their performances around the world and birthed over a dozen new compositions for oboe and trumpet. The duo has performed at Carnegie Hall, the Lincoln Center, and Merkin Hall. They have appeared as performer presenters at a variety of international conferences in recital and given master classes worldwide. As principal oboe for the Grange, Georgia Symphony Orchestra, held English horn positions with the Owensboro and Irving Symphonies, and oboe faculty positions at the University of North Colorado, Murray State University, and the University of South Florida. She's been a guest artist at numerous international Double Reed Society conferences, the Moab Music Festival, New Music Tampa, the Bonk Festival of New Music, and has appeared as a soloist, again with the LaGrange Symphony Orchestra, the Lone Star, Wind Orchestra, the Greeley Chamber of Orchestra, the Owensboro Symphony. She is a master of her craft. Welcome, Dr. Lauren Murray. Also honored to have here again with us, ladies and gentlemen. We had the opportunity to have him be a part of the conversation, and he will be a part of all of our arts conversations. Mr. John Parks, who is a dancer extraordinary, has danced with most of the major dance companies in the United States, is a faculty member at the University of South Florida. And both he and Susan have really been an integral part of helping to shape this journey. First of all, I'd like to start by saying, Susan, would you just share, why is this conversation important? Why is it important to have this conversation?
Well, I think the artists and musicians have known since the beginning of time the value of the arts to change us, to make us healthier, to make us stronger. And I think it's only been in the last 20 years or so where science has been able to literally get inside our brains and start to understand the neural mechanisms of these art forms, these magical changing agents. And in doing that, it helps us be able to create interventions, preventions, ways to use the arts to really enhance our well-being and to really amplify potential. And so I think it's a really exciting time to honor the age-old art with this new science that's really helping us understand more about who we are and the power that's inside of us through these multisensory aesthetic experiences that we call art.
Oh, that's great. You know, earlier when we were talking, when we were all talking, you used a phrase that really kind of struck me. It was really beautiful. You talked about the importance of kind of this duet between science and the artist. What you mean by that?
So, you know, a lot of times we think about science as being so rational and so literal and so progressive, but scientists are very creative in thinking about how to study things. And adversely, musicians are very methodical and artists are very methodical in figuring out how they compose and how they develop and how they create. So when you bring these two seemingly iconoclastic groups together, you find out that they have more in common than they do apart. And it just leads to such beautiful new music, new compositions, and new ways of understanding things very deeply that we haven't been able to do before. You know, from many societies now are so siloed where if you are studying neuroscience, you don't really look at psychology or philosophy, or if you're studying music, you may not really understand cognitive neuroscience. But when you push these fields together and you start to look at the messiness of how all of this actually is happening, coexisting at the same time, the conversations are richer, the answers are better, and I think we just make the world a more humane place. So I love the idea of bringing artists and scientists and other fields together to really share and talk and come away with something that we wouldn't have come away with if we were on our own.
Well, I'm in the field of public health primarily now, but my first career was as a singer-songwriter and a musician. So for several years, I toured full-time playing songs around the US and around the world, and had done that work for a long time. I mentioned earlier when we were talking that my dad is a conservative pastor, and he wanted all of his children to learn how to play piano so that they could play the hymns for church on Sunday mornings. But I also recognized when I was really little that as a woman and as a young person, I didn't really have a voice in my church, given a lot of the belief systems that church was a part of. But if I could sing, I could say kind of whatever I wanted. I was often invited to the stage to sing. And as a songwriter, that was really important to me because it was why I started writing songs, because it was a way for me to put out into the world something that I cared about, that I felt like couldn't be heard otherwise. And it became a way for me to work through difficult histories in my family of domestic violence or mental illness. So when I began touring, I realized that some of those songs that were about those kind of stigmatized topics, whether it was domestic violence or depression or things like that, were always the songs that people lined up afterwards to talk about. And I've had dozens of women, for example, tell me that they had been abused, and I was the first person they had ever told. And they told me because I had sung a song about it, and they could connect their story to that song. And it made me really curious about what the music was doing for me throughout my life. Why was I turning to music, and what was the importance of songwriting for me? But then also culturally and socioculturally, what did it mean for these women that they had not been able to tell a doctor previously or a therapist previously? What did it mean for them that their doctor didn't speak in that language and that I did? And what did that mean for the lack of care that they might have been getting? Or so I became interested in music as a form of communication, and who is listening in what fields, and how can we learn more about ourselves and each other if we learn how to speak across the seeming divide. Like Susan was mentioned, it's a seeming divide, it's not a real divide. The seeming divide between science and art, between health and music, and these kinds of ways that we express ourselves, and always have.
My whole life I was fascinated by music and anything musical. I think very early one of my cousins, she played the piano, and I was just drawn to that as a very young child. And so, they made sure that I was put in piano lessons, and that sort of interest was cultivated. But to me, I was always really interested just in sound, and there's the sound of music and the sound of different instruments together, and playing, being able to collaborate and with different kinds of instruments and different people. And so I think my whole life, that's sort of what I've been being pushed by, is the idea of collaboration and the creation of sound, and kind of what that does for you, the performer, and also how you can speak to an audience through that. And so I currently now play in an oboe trumpet duo. And sometimes people are like, oboe and trumpet, that's really weird. And but when you hear the two together, the timbre of the two instruments, there's a lot of similarities. My husband and I are the duo, and we have very shared concepts about how we play. And so we are able to create a lot of different colors and a lot of different kinds of sounds with the music that we perform. And so for me, I've really now working in collaboration with composers. We play a lot of new music. We've commissioned works for oboe and trumpet for us to perform. And this idea of taking music that's been written on a piece of paper and kind of bringing it to life, and trying to first interpret maybe what the composer is trying to say, those sounds that the composer has put down on paper that is in their head. How can we interpret that, and how can we speak that for them so that it then speaks to an audience member or somebody else? So to me, the process of having a collaboration with a person who creates a first idea, and then creating the sound of that idea, and then having it ingested by someone else, that beautiful triangle that some people talk about is kind of what it's all about for me. This idea of collaborating on all those fronts and creating an environment for creativity, but also for enjoyment, but also for sort of growing, and the beauty of that, with the idea that every time you play something, you might speak it a little bit differently. You might be feeling a little bit differently. You might spend a little more time with it, and the music might say something different to you than it did the day before. And so, I love playing new music simply because at first, as a classically trained musician, you sort of grow up with all these rules and regulations that you have to keep in order to play the music. And that becomes very intimidating for people. And I feel like if you can kind of be free with the music and interpret it on your own at first, and then maybe take that feeling of freedom that you had with this new music and go back to, say, the Mozart concerto, and go, okay, so how can I listen to what Mozart was writing and maybe convey that in a different way without worrying so much about the rules, but really expressively what I want to say about that. So to me, that's what drives me in this process on every level, when I'm playing and making music.
Journey for me. When I was a very little girl, where we lived, when people got married and had children, they didn't move out, they moved in. So I lived in a really big house, filled with family. There were always kids around, and there were always, I guess, little pockets of family in this one big family. And my uncle Richard, was a singer, and he formed a group called the Fascinations, and they were an a cappella group. And I was 3 or 4 years old, and whenever they would always rehearse in the living room. And whenever they were rehearsing, I would insist, they were always rehearsing at bedtime for me, it seemed. And I would insist, in fact, I'd throw a tantrum if my mother wouldn't bring a basin into the living room so that I could take a bath while they were rehearsing. So that's really where it began. And so that's the real origin story. The other thing that Susan, the memory that she evoked for me, was that later on, our house was family central, our nuclear family. So it was our house every single weekend for 30 years, for about 30 years, where family gathered on Saturdays. And at the time, my parents and my siblings and I lived in a small apartment. And on any given Saturday, we'd have between 20 and 50 people in our house. And there was always music, and there was always laughter, and there was always dancing, and there was always singing. And one of the things that Susan helped me understand just in this moment when she said it was, I didn't realize that in those family gatherings was where I was learning about joy. And I was attaching joy to music. And probably the third thing that drove this was something that I described earlier when we were talking, and that is I grew up in New York City, and I was in public school at a time when you couldn't leave public school without learning how to, something in the arts. You learned how to draw, you learned how to act, and you learned how to sing. And in my case, I learned to play classical music. And I always described myself as a latch bass player. So it was family and New York City Public School that really began my journey into not even really understanding front of brain for me, but more on a visceral, spiritual level, that the arts was where I found expression and where I could fully express who I really am. And so that is the very short story of how I ended up as the executive director of the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. There are a lot of decades in between, but that's the beginning, and that's at least the first part of the chronology.
Journey was a little bit different because I'm not a musician, but I first started listening to music at home with the spirituals and gospel music and jazz music and classical music. My mother was an avid player of music, so we listened to a lot of music on the radio as well as records. There was one tune, however, that caught my fancy, and it was a song by, I think, Henry Lane or Frankie Lane. It was called Mule Train. And it was a country western tune, and for some reason, anytime I would hear that tune, I would just get up and I would start dancing. I would start moving. And later on, I realized that it had a fast beat and a slow beat and a medium tempo to it. And so what drew me to music was the rhythm and the sound of the pulse, the sound of the bass and the drum. And I've been chasing that sound ever since. For music, the music for me is a language. It helps communicates movement to me, so that as as a dancer, as a performer, I gear on to the sound and the tempo and what the music is saying. And I use that in order to inspire me both as a dancer and as a choreographer.
My story and my experience is that for me, I can never ever remember a time in my life when music wasn't a really, really important part of my total being. I started out in the world at the age of 18 months old. I became a ward of the state. So in those developmental years, 0 to 4, in my case, 0 to 5.5, where I wasn't held a lot consistently by the same people. I wasn't in a family setting. And so what my body did for me is it began to create a connection for me between movement, motion, and sound. So I was one of those children that was a perpetual noisemaker. I mean, I created sound because I could feel it from the inside out. It's how I calmed myself. It's how I kind of came to know myself. And then there's this sort of, and I'm no scientist, of course, but there's kind of a neurological connection to all the nerves, and everything goes to the spine. So I was one of those kids that would sit and kind of rock and hit my head against the wall and create sound. It was just the way that I knew to be. I wasn't violent or anything like that, but so people kind of left me alone, and until I got a little bit older and got a little bit more aggressive with it and could kind of hit my head against walls and wake people up in the middle of the night. But the reality was the frequency of sound and the frequency of my own voice. I hummed a lot. I mimicked sounds that I heard because it connected to my neurological system. Then as I got older and I began to learn how to speak and communicate, it was much more natural for me to sing what I was thinking than to say what I was thinking. It was just right in my mind. It was like, it was a natural thing. If somebody asked me a question, then I would just normally answer it like this. It just felt right for me to communicate through an extended melody. And people thought that was kind of funny and kind of cool, but it was my way of being. So the sort of science of my knowingness of myself was based upon my relationship with sound internally, because I could feel it. And then externally, thankfully, I was given an instrument, a voice that people was calming and people liked it. And then my life became all about music and all about the arts.
I feel like in a culture that's so much about immediate gratification, and we don't allow ourselves to feel pain and suffering or acknowledge that we each have suffering, very different from one another. But culturally, there's been such huge suffering individually, whether that's because of domestic violence or abuse or neglect. Or because just how we're wired, we're so sensitive that we feel more pain in a way that maybe is different than each other, but we all have that, right? We all, in some way, we share that. And I think music in particular, which is the most studied type of art, we see that there are so many neurobiological things happening when we are engaged in sound and in music. Yesterday I had a conversation with some researchers around the auditory cortex, and how the auditory cortex is sort of like that junction box where sound comes in, but then it goes out to many different parts of the brain for many different reasons. And so it's kind of, I use the term magic wand. It's this sound, the ability for sound to do so many things for so many different reasons is an elixir in a way that, and an alchemy in almost like nothing else. No medication can do that. No pharmacological medication can do that. It's just so healing. And it's also so connecting. So think about self-healing and group belonging and connectivity at the same time, right? That's extraordinary. And I'll say one other thing, and then, I think we think about this as prevention. We think about it as intervention, so to heal us, but then also to maintain and to keep balance in our lives.
I teach a lot of general music and music appreciation kinds of classes, and one of the things I spend a lot of time with is how the music sounds and how that sound affects you. Like, for instance, like the kind of music that might be used in a scary movie as opposed to depicting a happy picnic out in the middle of a field. You know, it's sort of the timbres that might be used, or the keys, or the modality and that sort of thing of music. And it's interesting, depending on who you're playing the music for, what their experiences are and what their response to the music is. And so someone who's raised in a completely Western art music kind of environment, we hear very dissonant kind of music and think, oh, bad, scary, anxious sort of things. But someone who was raised in a culture that maybe doesn't just use 12 tones but uses 32, those dissonances and those different harmonies don't mean that to them. They mean something very different, and it may not be a negative thing. And so I'm always fascinated, especially with very young students. I do a lot of activities with having them listen and use colors and draw pictures when they're listening to sort of get what their personal picture is from the music. And it's remarkable when they haven't had any education about music or anybody projecting upon them what a particular sound means, the different ideas that come out of them. But conversely, if they already have had a very specific kind of experience at home or maybe culturally, their story is really different when they're listening to that music. So to me, that is, and as I learn and I go along, kind of listen to different kinds of music, that to me becomes very fascinating in my own interpretation. You know, why am I interpreting this way? And why does this music sound this way to me? And what is it in my past that made me think this music is frightening as opposed to it being exciting, or, you know, that sort of thing. And so I think that the more you listen and really visualize what that music is saying, it's incredibly fascinating. And so that to me educationally drives me. I'm always curious about how people are listening to something, how they're hearing it, and what their experiences are doing to interpret that for them.
At the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, this is such a timely, interesting discussion for me, because one of the things we've begun doing is we've established a relationship with Columbia University, and we've begun, thanks to our terrific program director, Ryan Maloney, we've begun to explore the connection between jazz and neuroscience. And so we're having these events, or at least before we were all sent home because of the pandemic, we were having these events where people would come into the museum, and we'd have someone like Susan from Columbia University, and we'd have a performer there, and we'd really explore exactly what Lauren is talking about, how music affects the body, how music affects the mind, but in particular, how jazz affects the mind in a very specific way. And Susan and Tasha and Lauren can speak more specifically to this, but there are studies that show that jazz, similarly to dance, because it's improvisational, and I mean social dance, not necessarily choreographed dance, but social dancing, they just activate different parts of the neurological system that inspire creativity and physicality in entirely different ways. And so one of the things we've begun doing at the Jazz Museum is exploring exactly those things. And this, of course, I'm a storyteller, right? So everything reminds me of a story. And one of the stories that this part of our conversation is reminding me of is a moment about 8 or 9 months ago at the museum. We're dark on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And so we literally keep the front of the museum dark while we're in the back offices. And a doorbell rang, our doorbell rang. And there was a performer who lives in Harlem who asked if he could simply come in and play the piano. I won't bother anybody, can I play the piano? And so we knew him. And so of course we said yes. And a couple of days later, one of us received a note from him that said, thank you. I was really thinking about taking my life. I was having a really dark time, and just the ability to express myself, to sit down at the piano and touch the keys, and these are my words, have this relationship with the music, with the museum, with myself, with the divine. You saved me, and I want to thank you for that. And so I take it as not only a personal responsibility, but part of the responsibility of the museum to really take that on, take that experience on as part of what we do. One of my favorite discussions at the museum is with another performer, another very famous performer who talks about what is the social responsibility of the artist? What is the social responsibility of the arts community? And I think we all fall in different places about that, but that experience and the experiences we've been having at the museum with jazz in particular, music in general, and its connection to the mind, the body, and the spirit, and what it can do to move you in different places, similarly to what Lauren has just described, is a really important responsibility for the museum.
Yeah, there's a organization called One Mind, a philanthropic organization that's supporting mental health research in a really general way, but they're also supporting an initiative called Music and the Brain that's a partnership with the International Arts and Mind Lab. And we are looking at how music is being used in the treatment of serious mental illness, and particularly 5 diagnoses: PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. And there's a general understanding or intuitive understanding, I think, among most people that music can make you feel better in a general sense. If you're just feeling down, we sort of self-medicate, quote unquote, put on a nice happy song and feel a little bit better. But we don't know quite as much about how music can be used in the treatment of a diagnosed illness, particularly if it's a more serious diagnosis or a more serious experience. And so we wanted, with this initiative, to look at what has been done. Can we get an idea of the landscape of that field, what has been done? And so that we can know what should be done, what's the next step that would make this either more effective, or if it's already effective, what could make it more available and accessible? What is it that maybe a prescriber or a policymaker would need to know about this in order to know that this is a viable alternative if it is? So we are, what we have found in the first part of this, which has been a scoping review to sort of map the evidence that exists, is that there's a lot of really promising findings that music tends to have good results that are better than treatment as usual sometimes, or at least definitely not worse. that are often, people are self-reporting feeling much better, but there's not necessarily as much rigor behind these studies as we would need in order to advance them from a prescriptive standpoint or in the healthcare system. So what's exciting is that this partnership is looking at, okay, how can we help support the field so that scientists and musicians who want to look into this can feel supported, that they know how to best do that, how to make their work as rigorous as possible. And then also, what is it that we could be studying as part of this initiative? What could we be funding that would be the next best step in learning the particular mechanisms, for example, behind why music has been found to be helpful for schizophrenia, or when might music be contraindicated for something like depression? We know that music can help people feel better, but it's also been shown to make people ruminate a little bit. And that's variable. With anxiety, it almost always helps. With depression, sometimes it doesn't quite help. Sometimes it keeps you there. So we would need to get really precise about the mechanisms and about when it can be used for whom and who selects the music, what types of music are involved. There's lots of questions about equity and access and subjectivity that have to be wrapped into it, but it's an exciting time to be looking at the field for sure.
Wow, that's fantastic. John, I know that with the formalization of the Parks Institute and the work that you're doing really in terms of exploration of movement as a modality for health and well-being, beyond just a specific conversation about dance, but to really talk about the movement of the body, and in the experiences that you create using music from around the world, you know, music from the diaspora, music from the strains of classical music, from the strains of jazz. As an institute, as the Parks Institute, where is that moving, kind of that emergence of movement and music working towards on this pathway of health and well-being?
Yeah, well, we generally start with the breath, which is I mentioned before in terms of rhythm. So the breath really dictates what the pace and the pulse is, and then from there, we might put on different kinds of music, just to kind of stimulate ideas. As I hear stories, and as everyone has stories in terms of their past and what has stimulated them and inspired them, and Tasha, as you mentioned, that certain music affects people in different ways, and it does in terms of in terms of how you were introduced to music, how you were introduced to sound, how you felt when you first heard something. And so I think those are important things. So we basically can start with playing music and having a discussion in terms of, well, you know, how much jazz do you know? I mean, who do you like? You know, what instrument do you gravitate to? And those sounds and those styles and forms of music then begin to resonate when you begin to choreograph and put movement together. So I'm really kind of gravitated a little bit more now towards the effect that music has on ideas and thoughts and aspirations and dreams. So it's quite exciting, and I like to play around with a lot of different kinds of music. But my major focus is jazz music and music that has lyrics to it.
You know, sound is a part of our reality. It's such a rich part of our reality. It's something that, it's kind of that first instinct that develops and one of the last ones to go, you know, when we make our transition from this world. So, you know, on behalf of the Straz Center for the Performing Arts, we are so thankful for our collaboration with Johns Hopkins. We are so thankful for our collaboration now with the National Museum of Jazz in Harlem, and some of the inclusive and involvement that we'll have together. So appreciative of the work that the Patel Conservatory is doing and the richness of that, as this conversation about the health and wellness of our community through the arts. And I've got a new phrase now: the power of the duo is really, really great. This combination of the artist and the scientist as we move together. Thank you to you all for spending time with us. Thanks everybody for participating in this. Thank you, Tasha. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, John. I'm Fred Johnson from the Straz Center for the Performing Arts. Stay strong, stay well, be happy. Until next time, take care, and we'll be talking about theater. Take care. Bye-bye.